Okay. When we began to think about this teach-in, we discussed notions of alternatives, and we thought about potential alternatives that have to do with the rise of the working class in China, and we thought about real alternatives like Venezuela and Bolivia, other Latin American alternatives. We thought about some embryonic alternatives in Canada, all of which are in workshops going on at this time, and those are not my topics. My topic is the notion of negative alternatives to some degree. This is not intended to depress you, but rather to present the context, put the present into the context of the past so that we can prepare for and influence the future. So this may be somewhat incoherent, but I'm going to look at 5 things. I'm going to look at the imperialist coalition that is now taking shape to fight the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and its resemblance to the imperialist intervention against the Yihetuan movement, better known as the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900. I'm going to look at neoliberal economics and social policy in Canada and other places. I'm going to look at religious fundamentalism and why Stephen Harper has so much in common with the people he's dropping bombs on. And Russian nationalism and its roots in the Crimean War, and Japanese versus Chinese territorial claims and their roots in Sino-Japanese relations between 1870 and 1900. So all this kind of looks like looking at the 19th century, really the second half of the 19th century, and its impact today. And that's kind of what it is. And it's a funny thing, the subtitle of this workshop, Fundamentalists of All Countries Unite, is The Reappearance of Everything Old, which is in fact the title of a song. I don't know if anybody knows the song, written by a guy named Peter Allen. Not one of your big songwriters, but well known enough. And that song goes, when trumpets were mellow and every gal only had one fellow. No need to remember when, 'cause everything old is new again. Get out your white suit, your tap shoes and tails. Let's go backwards when forward fails. And movie stars you thought were long dead now are framed beside your bed. Don't throw the past away. You might need it some rainy day. Dreams can come true again when everything old is new again. And I think that's a lovely song and a perfectly reactionary song that celebrates everything wrong in the world in many ways. The notion of let's go backwards when forward fails, I think has a lot to do. I saw that lyric and I thought, this guy is actually pretty smart. And in those areas that I talked about, in a sense, that's what's happening. We're going backwards where forwards has failed. They all have resonance in Canada today. The one big fundamental idea missing in these notions of fundamentalism, which I'll talk to, is what Tony Benn, the British politician who died recently, left-wing Labour peer, described as a return to 19th century values, unvarnished class struggle and socialism. This is perhaps the one fundamentalist belief of the late 19th century that in fact has not yet been restored. The notion of fundamentalism, I wondered what it meant. I went to the Oxford English Dictionary, where you always go if you're looking for a definition. And it says, a form of a religion, especially Islam or Protestant Christianity, that upholds belief in the strict literal interpretation of Scripture. Okay? Then it gave the example of strict adherence to the basic principles of any subject or discipline, free market fundamentalism. And I thought that that was great. Islamic fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, particularly the Protestant variety, and free market fundamentalism. And lo and behold, all these things are applicable. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, modern Christian fundamentalism arose from American millenarian sects of the 19th century and has become associated with reaction against social and political liberalism and rejection of the theory of evolution, okay? Islamic fundamentalism appeared in the 18th and 19th centuries as a reaction to the disintegration of Islamic political and economic power, asserting that Islam is central to both state and society and advocating strict adherence to the Quran and to Islamic law. Okay, these are pretty good and I think pretty relevant. So, and I think they definitely fit into the song, "Don't Throw the Past Away. You might need it some rainy day. Dreams can come true again when everything old is new again." Right now, we see the new war, similar to previous wars, particularly of the imperialist coalition that has been lashed together to attack the Islamic organizations in Iraq and Syria. And when I was thinking about this, I said, okay, what about previous coalitions of this type? And one of them is definitely the imperialist intervention against the Yuetan movement, better known as the Boxer Rebellion. Why Boxers? Because they trained physically for fighting, so that they were called by the Westerners Boxers. There's a movie, if you want, 55 Days at Peking, directed by Nicholas Ray. Anybody know Nicholas Ray? He directed James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, which is a better film than 55 Days at Peking. It's an irony of sorts, but there you go. Ava Gardner was in it, and David Niven. It's one of these classic movies that celebrated imperialist intervention against half-naked savages. The Iochiwan, which is, I think, a better pronunciation, stands for Righteous and Harmonious Fists. And it was a secret society that practiced calisthenics and boxing, and their main goal was to oppose foreign imperialism that was then dominating China after the Opium Wars of the 1840s, and Christianity. There were two big imports being forced upon the Chinese in this period, and one of them was Christianity, which they had little or no use for, and the other was opium, which they had equally little or no use for, and both of them were being imposed on them by imperialism, particularly British. The Chinese government was somewhat ambivalent about this movement because they liked it on the one hand because they hated the foreign occupiers. On the other hand, they feared the radicalized masses who were part of this movement. So in 1900, the Yuetan laid siege to foreign sectors of Beijing, then called Peking, in a siege of 55 days. The movement was defeated by a coalition of imperialist armies and navies called the Eight-Nation Alliance. It was Austria-Hungary, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. You just Google, I suppose, the Eight-Nation Alliance, and it'll all be there. Much like the coalition fighting the Islamic State today, there was little that held these folks together ideologically. In fact, in a few years, 14 years to be exact, they would be cutting each other's throats. In fact, in the case of Russia and Japan, in 5 years. In the 4 years, really, in the Russo-Japanese War. But right now, they were allied against the insurgent Chinese masses. The fact that Japan, that was not all that friendly to Christianity itself, would engage with this project is kind of symbolic in much the same way that today you have an unholy coalition in every sense of the term, where Saudi Arabian Sunni fundamentalists are united with the Americans against other Sunni fundamentalists and Shia. And anyway, I'll get to that. One of the highlights of this thing, and it's a lovely idea, was the international gun. They had this thing, it was a cannon, and it was called the international gun because the barrel was British, the carriage was Italian, the shells Russian, and the crew's American. You can't think of anything more symbolic than that. So Japan was an absolute monarchy, so was China. Britain was a constitutional one, France and the United States republics, Italy, Germany, and Austria-Hungary somewhere in between. But what united them, in the same way that what unites the coalition right now active in Syria and Iraq, was plunder. They were all up for plunder. Plunder of the world, and in this case particularly the plunder of China, which was weak and they had plans for. So Japan they did the heavy lifting. They sent 20,000 troops and 18 warships. Russia came second with 12,000 troops and 10 ships. The Brits, 10,000 troops and 8 ships. France, the United States, lesser. Italy down to 80 Marines and 2 ships. They invaded and occupied Beijing in August of 1900. The emperor fled. There were peace talks. The Chinese gave up a great deal. Kenneth Clark, in a book, said, following the taking of Peking, troops from the international force looted the capital city and even ransacked the Forbidden City with many Chinese treasures finding their way back to Europe. So when you go to the great museums of Europe and look at their Chinese collection, many of these were in fact the plunder, literally, of the intervention in Beijing in 1900. Of course, an unknown number of people believed to be boxers were beheaded, both during and after the uprising. So we can say that beheading has a long tradition, and of course it goes certainly at least back to King Charles I, who was beheaded by the forces of Oliver Cromwell, and etc. So when the world is outraged at the beheading of a couple of Americans or Brits who have fallen prey to various forces there, this notion of beheading is not such a alien concept to many of the people, including, of course, the Saudis, who practice it, if not daily, at least weekly. So there's hypocrisy piled upon hypocrisy. The humiliation of the Chinese government and the reparations demanded by the invaders had one important impact. They led to a resentment that would help forge the Chinese Revolution of 1911, which overthrew the dynasty and created an incipient democracy, and the formation of the May 4th student movement in 1919, which led to the formation of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921, and the historical memory of Western and Japanese occupation and exploitation that remains today. We'll see that again when we look at a section on Japan and China. And that's something that's important and something that perhaps is a lesson that can be learned, that the intervention of foreign armies in various places may have short-term gains, but it inevitably has long-term negative impacts on the people who do it. The resonance today is the similarity to the US-formed coalition operating in the Middle East. As with the 8-nation alliance, we can see literally in some ways an unholy coalition of forces ranging from Iraqi Shia militias to Sunni Salafist regimes to the forces of Christianity to the forces of secularism, etc. Truly a dog's breakfast held together by the dream of plunder, oil. But what about religion, you say? Because certainly there is religion involved in this, and that's the second point that I want to deal with in terms of the resonance of this. The irony of the religion is that something that does hold these folks together is a vision of the end of the world, but that vision of the end of the world is shared across the battlefield. Mr. al-Baghdadi, whose first name I forget and didn't write down, certainly has that vision of the end of the world as an extreme Salafist Sunni, but so does our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, and many of his associates. In fact, their vision of the end of the world is separated by 646 kilometers, and I'll get to that. Marcy McDonald has written a book, I don't know if anybody here has seen it, called, don't worry, I won't disconnect you, The Armageddon Factor. Anybody read it? Great book. And it is subtitled The Rise of Christian Nationalism in Canada. Okay, what the heck is Christian nationalism, you might ask? Well, Marcy McDonald, in an interview not long ago, defined it. Quote, it's a long quote, when I use the term Christian nationalism, excuse me, I'm not referring to all evangelicals or all Christians who are politically active. There is a very small wing of the evangelical community, most of them Pentecostals, it turns out, but it certainly doesn't apply to all Pentecostals who believe firmly not only that the end times are coming, but that Canada has a very specific preordained role for the end times. This is spelled out, apparently, in the 72nd Psalm, verse 8. He shall have dominion also from sea to sea and from the river until the ends of the earth. So this sea to sea business, you got to understand, captured the imagination of those who stare longingly at Ud Mari ad Musque, or whatever it is, from sea to sea in Canada, Canadian Shield or whatever. And this was written long before Canada was a factor in anything, of course, aside from some First Nations who were living here, and long before Jesus was born. But Christian nationalists believe that Canada's geography was described perfectly, and so that they believe that God has a plan for Canada in the end times as a refuge among nations. Okay? Now, over the years, apparently, we have slipped from this prophetic role and are from preparedness. I'm still quoting Marcy now. We've gotten rid of laws against abortion. We brought in same-sex marriage. We are not able to fulfill our destiny as a Christian nation, so God sent us a wake-up call. Okay? On May 24th, 2006, the clock on the Peace Tower stopped where the verse is written at 7:28. Okay? So for Christian nationalists in Canada, a number of whom are in the Harper government and may well include the Prime Minister, this is a message from God that you would better get this Christian nation thing going before it's too late. This may sound like idiocy, but these people are real. They have very strong ties to the government. They have been hosted by Harper. He has written them letters to their rallies. They have met with over 300 parliamentarians, which means they met with representatives of every political party in the House. They've been at VIP receptions. They've been used in campaign spots. So Marcy sends a bit of a wake-up about this, and of course, you might want to be very careful at 7:28 on any given day. Now, what is all this? I looked up on a Christian website, what is the rapture and what is the tribulation? Okay? The rapture, end times, when all true believers who are still alive before the end of the world will be taken from the earth by God into heaven. The term describing this event is the rapture. It's not found in the Bible, but the theory apparently is based on Scripture, and those who accept the rapture theory believe that all non-believers on earth at the time will be left behind for the tribulation period. Okay, I hope you're getting this. What is the tribulation? I looked that up too. The tribulation, recent world events, especially in the Middle East, have many Christians studying the Bible for an understanding of end times events. They look at what is the tribulation. The tribulation was taught by Bible scholars, and it encompasses a future 7-year period when God will complete his discipline of Israel and final judgment upon the unbelieving citizens of the world. This may include some of you, think about it. Those who accept a pre-tribulation rapture theory believe that Christians who have trusted Christ as Lord and Savior will escape the tribulation. Okay. So this is what the Prime Minister and quite possibly, and she goes into some detail of where he goes to church, and certainly a number of his friends and associates think. Okay. Now, a lot of this has to do with the term called Armageddon. Armageddon, in fact, refers to, it appears once in the Greek New Testament, and refers to a hill mount named Megiddo. Megiddo, or place of crowds. Megiddo is, in fact, not a mountain, but a hill on which ancient forts were built to guard the Via Maris, trade route linking Egypt with the northern empires of Syria, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Today, Megiddo is a town 40 kilometers west-southwest of the southern tip of the Sea of Galilee in Israel. Okay, and Jesus is going to return to earth, according to premillennial Christianity, defeat the Antichrist, the false prophet, and Satan the devil in the battle of Armageddon. Then Satan gets put in a bottomless pit for 1,000 years, known as the millennium. That's why they call it millenarianism. And after being released from the abyss, he will gather Gog and Magog, and they will encamp surrounding the holy ones and the beloved city. Fire, which is Jerusalem, fire will come down for God out of heaven and devour Gog and Magog, the devil, death, and etc. Okay. Not far from Megiddo, 646.6 kilometers north, is a town called Dabik. Dabik is a small town. It's in Syria near the Turkish border. Why is this important? Dabik is the site of a Quranic prediction. The area of Dabik is mentioned as a place of some of the events of the Muslim Malahim, which equates to the tribulation. Abu Huraira, companion to the prophet, reported that God's messenger, the prophet, said the final hour of history will not be established until the Romans land either at Al-Amaq or at Dabik. Then an army formed from Al-Madinah of the best people on the earth will leave for them. For this reason, the name of the online magazine of the Islamic State is Dabik. So if you happen to be doing a little research into the Islamic State, and you see a magazine called Dabik and you wonder why, it is because that is in one area of Islamic extremism where the final battle will occur. And Christian brethren, including many, as I say, in our government, think that it will be 646.6 kilometers further south. This is a rather small geographical argument compared to the theological debate. the fact that these people are fighting each other gives rise to wonder. They seem to have a good deal in common in terms of their worldview. So what are they fighting over? Well, plunder, oil, just as the various people that formed the Eight-Nation Alliance in China to put down the so-called Boxer Rebellion were also fighting for spoils and plunder. But let it be said, it is not just the oil. They have a higher purpose, which is to further bringing about Armageddon and all the wonderful things that happen and Satan going to hell, etc. More than I have time here to go into. But it's interesting that there are contemporary battles which reference these things. And certainly Canada is not foreign from it, let alone the fact that 728, Psalm, etc., something might happen here. The late 19th century also, in fact mid-19th century, has a profound impact on what is going on in Eastern Europe. Most folks in Canada know three things maybe about the Crimean War. You may have had to read The Charge of the Light Brigade, written by the Poet Laureate of England, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Into the Valley of Death, Road to 600, etc. You've probably heard of Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, making, the nurse, volunteer nurse, etc. in the battle. And you may have at some point worn a balaclava and wondered why it was called a balaclava. All these things are connected to the Crimean War. Tennyson's poem was published in the Examiner about a bad decision during the Battle of Balaclava. He was a poet laureate, so it's a kind of government grant that he got to write the thing. The balaclava, it's the fashion accessory. During the Crimean War, handmade balaclavas were sent to British troops to protect them from the cold weather, because the troops were poorly supplied, so they relied on civilians, women, knitting circles to send these balaclava. At any rate, it was not used during the war, but later in 1881. And there's Florence Nightingale. The Crimean War, which started in October of 1853 and lasted till 1856, was a conflict Russia lost to yet another alliance, another unholy alliance in some ways, of France, Britain, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia. Sardinia at that point encompassing Piemonte and Sardinia, a good deal of Italy. So why were they fighting there? In fact, if you want to read about it, Karl Marx covered it very well for the New York Tribune. And if you just go Karl Marx, New York Tribune, Crimean War, many, many articles looking at what happened. He was a journalist. He made his living that way. There was a certain gloss of religion in this thing. The rights of Christians in Jerusalem apparently were at risk, but the real causes involved the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of a stronger Russia and the desire of Britain and France to forbid Russia to gain territory and power at Ottoman expense. The Russian dream of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th century were one word: Constantinople. They wanted Constantinople. Why did they want Constantinople? Real estate? No. They wanted the Bosphorus. They wanted the ability to control entrance and exit from the Black Sea, which, because of the freezing, global warming would have solved things, but because of the freezing of most of the ocean, the challenges, it was their warm water port. Same reason they wanted it, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Anyway, it's a longer story. But they wanted the Black Sea. And the British and French did not want them to have the Black Sea, and they did not want a weakened Ottoman Empire So when the Russians fought the Ottomans, the British and the French then fought the Russians. The Ottomans declared war in 1853. They suffered a major defeat. Russia did have the Black Sea. Then the French and the British intervened, and there was a big battle at a Russian naval base that you might have heard of if you follow the news, called Sevastopol. Where is Sevastopol? On the Crimea. What is Sevastopol? Sevastopol is a major Russian naval base, of which there was a big fight during the war. The Allies realized that if they captured Sevastopol, they could control the Black Sea and win the war. And they more or less did, and prohibited Russia from having a navy in the Black Sea. Most of the fighting was a French army and a smaller British army fighting to capture Sevastopol. Then various neutrals joined in after Sevastopol fell, and Russia made peace. They got their own back later, but they made peace, and the religious issues had been resolved, etc. So the major victory over Russia was that Russia could not have warships in the Black Sea, and the naval base of Sevastopol was in imperialist hands, or at least French and British hands. The war had a permanent impact, though. Through nationalist movements incited by the war, a bunch of new states came into being. The first one was Romania, from the provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia. But also the Ukraine, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and various regions in the Crimea and the Caucasus all changed in one way or another because of the Crimean War. And I don't have nearly the time to go into how they changed, and by and large, wasn't a big deal. But what was a big deal was that Russia was humiliated. But it survived, and it began to launch a reform program to remedy its glaring economic, social, and military weaknesses. Did it do so? No, not right away. It lost again to Japan in 1904, 1905, and the army fell apart in 1917, of course, in the First World War. However, under the leadership of the Bolsheviks, and in particular Trotsky, who forged the Red Army, the Russian military might would be restored, and they defeated a dozen or so imperialist armies between 1918 and 1920, including Canada, by the way, which sent troops and was defeated. And of course, the Crimea has loomed large in the historical memory of Russians. So the chance that in a confrontation between Russia and the Ukraine, with Ukraine being backed by NATO, which of course includes the French and British who fought in the Battle of Sevastopol, amongst others, that the chance of Sevastopol and the Crimea in general being lost, as it were, to Russia was about as likely as them selling off St. Basil's Cathedral opposite the Kremlin in Moscow. It just was not going to happen. It is a major piece of Russian national consciousness, and handing it over to people whom they term neo-fascists was just not going to happen, because there was another Battle of Sevastopol during the Second World War. It was one of the heroic cities in the Soviet Union that was ultimately leveled by fascism, but again, was important. Countries have long memories. Sometimes those memories are false memories, but that is not the point. If you look at the obsession of the Canadian government with the War of 1812, you begin to get a sense. And this was something that Canada didn't exist, but still, it's a big deal. And near as I can tell, the only thing that matters is we have Laura Secord chocolates and not Martha Washington chocolates. But anyway, So these memories, the humiliation of Russia in the Crimean War is very much a part of Russia's living memory. And there was no way the Crimea was going anywhere, least of all to a competing nationalism. And of course, for the Ukrainians, the Crimea has always been the Ukraine, even though this is not strictly true, etc. The hand of the 19th century lies heavy on the 21st in both Russia and the Ukraine, amongst other places. It also lies heavy in Japan and China, and the competing territorial claims and their roots in Sino-Japanese relations in the late 19th century. China has had an important influence on Japan. Linguistic, cultural, philosophical, in every way, Japan is profoundly rooted in Chinese culture. However, the student surpassed the teacher in many ways in the 19th century when Western imperialism pried open the Japanese market in the mid-19th century, and the Japanese responded with their own modernization, better known as the Meiji Restoration. China, meanwhile, was increasingly on its way to being a neo-colony victimized by Anglo-French armies in the mid-19th century, the Opium Wars, etc. Territory was seized, not least Hong Kong, tribute extracted, and Japan became a partner with Western imperialism in the robbery. And in fact, it became the most aggressive robber, being closest to the loot. In the 1870s, Japan took control of the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa being the best known, today still the site of an American military base. In 1894, the first Sino-Japanese War took place. And it went on different fronts until April of 1895. They didn't last all that long in those days, when the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed, 17th of April, and 1895, and China recognized the total independence of Korea, which basically meant that Korea was on its way to being sucked into being a Japanese colony, which would take place a few years later. They ceded the Liaodong Peninsula, which is in the south of Liaoning province near the border with Korea, if you ever want to look. It was kind of the first territorial grab by the Japanese on mainland there. The Japanese also got Taiwan and the Penghu, or Pescadores Islands, in perpetuity. They're now part of Taiwan province of China. The disputed islands, known as the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, were not named by this treaty, but Japan annexed them to Okinawa Prefecture, and the Japanese assert that this move was taken independently, or the China said that this was not included in the treaty. Japan says it was part of the deal for Taiwan, and today, if there is going to be a shooting war between the Japanese and the Chinese, it is going to be over those islands, uninhabited, but perhaps sitting on top of God knows what. So the first Sino-Japanese War was followed by a series of demands known as the 21 Demands that China was forced to agree to in 1915, which led to Japanese control of parts of Manchuria and the invasion of Manchuria by Japan in 1931 and of China proper in 1937. This is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. Of course, naming it second leads people to wonder what was the first, and this allows for the continuation of this. The entire memory of Japan's clash with and victory over a poor and weak China is very much alive in the minds of politicians and the public in both countries. As with the coalition that would intervene in the so-called Boxer Rebellion of 1900, the sacrifice of national integrity was an important element in the creation of the Kuomintang, the May 4th movement, and the Chinese Communist Party, and an organic part of the Chinese Revolution which still reverberates in China, where many of the social aims of the revolution have been long abandoned or superseded by so-called modernization, industrialization, reform, etc., and the emergence of a strong capitalist economy in China. But Chinese nationalism, which was an important part of this, the resentment of the treaties, the Opium War, the Japanese demands, etc., in the 19th century, fuel Chinese nationalism in the 21st century. The last thing I want to deal with a little bit is neoliberalism. Why neo? Because there was liberalism in the 19th century, and then there was something else. You can call it Keynesian economics, you can call it something a bit more progressive, one thing or another, but it broke from some of those traditions. It was a bit more humane, it was a little bit, anyway, it was different. And now it is back. In the United States, this has kind of led to the resurgence of two enduring images that are very much part of 19th century American ideology, and one of which is the gunslinger. The gunslinger is a fundamental, whether it's Billy the Kid on the outside of the law or Wyatt Earp, the great sheriff on the other side of the law, the notion of justice being administered by a powerful person with a weapon is something that is a long history in the United States, and Obama has appropriated this quite nicely with his fleet of drones and various things and the ability to kill from a distance just about anybody they want to, anywhere they want to, including, and this is somewhat dubious point of law, Americans without a trial. Killing foreigners has a long tradition in the United States. Killing Americans is rather new. And this again goes right back to the gunslinger, because you have these outlaws in Yemen and Iraq and various places, and they have to be dealt with. And capturing them, bringing them in for trial, this is a little bit beyond what the Americans are able to do, but blowing them to smithereens is something that technology has come up with. The other area of 19th century mythology, if you like, is the notion of the enlightened capitalist. Whether it be the Carnegie image, all those libraries, the Carnegie Hall, the Carnegie Library in Vancouver, all these things that the guy built, etc., whatever, and we now have that with people like Bill Gates, who gives billions of dollars to wonderful things, etc., you know, and Mark Zuckerberg and all these people, the new equivalent of the 19th century. Yeah, so the barons, exactly. So these people are back, both the gunslinger and the enlightened capitalist, who uses their ability to accumulate enormous amounts of money in the old days through oil, through railroads, etc., now through computers and God knows what, etc. So these images are there. This is also true in terms of economic and social policy in Canada, to one degree or another. There has always been a debate between neoliberalism and a more interventionist policy in Canada, a neo-Keynesian policy, but even before Keynes. In the election of 1878 in Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald, our alcoholic first prime minister, defeated the Liberal Party, which supported free trade, how times have changed, with a policy called the national policy. And the national policy was in favor of strong tariffs to protect industry, incipient, embryonic Canadian industry. And it was very popular in the center of the country, where most people lived, and it was rather unpopular in the West. And these debates went on. Sir Wilfrid Laurier was certainly involved with them. And the whole debate on immigration was also part of this, that the neoliberal social imagination extols entrepreneurship, self-reliance, sturdy individualism, and equates the untrammeled pursuit of self-interest and consumer satisfaction with human freedom. There are other things which look for more collective solutions, etc., and this was certainly played out around issues of immigration in the early 1900s and who was going to be allowed in, and where the image of the sturdy peasant, which was predominant, ultimately led by a guy named Clifton, who's a minister of immigration, as opposed to workers, industrial workers, who were frowned upon because God knows they might support unions, etc. And this in fact led to shattering of certain stereotypes, because the official policy ended up welcoming people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe into Canada, as opposed to people who were certainly people of the earth, as opposed to people who might be from more industrial and urban centers, etc. So, after a period during which many of those immigrants and a number of other people put together a vision, and of course this still obtains through Medicare and all the rest of that, that was more of a social policy, collective solution to human problems, we see right now, and it's not one way or the other, but we certainly see a resurgence of neoliberal economics, where people are left to their own, the privatization of everything possible. And this is very, very much a return to the 19th century. Education, private schools, medicine or medical care, private clinics. You want an MRI? You can have an MRI this afternoon. You got a grand? All these things, housing, well, why should we build public housing? After all, let the condominium market deal with all those things. That these things are not a direct return to the 19th century, but a return to the spirit of the 19th century. And this kind of the trade agreements that turn their backs on a whole series of things, agreements that turn its back on environmental concerns and all the rest of that, is the last area that I think that we can see is a kind of return to the 19th century, really to a period before the First World War. And I think if we take all of those together and we look at the world and we say, okay, well, there's Russian nationalism resurgent. Why? Well, you know, what's so important about the Crimea and Sevastopol, and why do the Ukrainians care so much, and all the rest of that? And then we look at what's happening in the Middle East, and we look at some of the religious beliefs of people on both sides of this thing. And the other things that I've mentioned, the Japanese and the Chinese, the world actually, all those things that sort of look like they have nothing to do with each other. What the hell do the religious beliefs of Stephen Harper have to do with Russian nationalism, have to do with Obama and his drones, have to do with, etc., all these things? In a sense, you can see that there's a kind of unity of purpose that goes back to a period before the 20th century, before socialism, before Keynesian economics, before regulatory states that actually tried to intervene to protect things in terms of plunderbund coalitions of imperialist armies marching here and there, taking whatever they can find. All this stuff is floating around out there, and it all looks like something we have seen before. And why is this the case? This is the case because of a structural crisis of capitalism, which leads people, as the song says, don't throw the past away. You might need it some rainy day. Dreams can come true again when everything old is new again. And I think to a certain degree, that is precisely what we're dealing with in the period right now. And as I mentioned, there is another fundamentalism, which is a fundamentalism that also goes back to the 19th century. The Russian socialists, the Chartists in England, the radical, the Paris Commune, etc., which is a vision of an earth that can be shared and administered collectively through getting rid of the various forces and the various ideas that also harken back to that period. I'll stop there.